I knew something was wrong the moment my mother's hand trembled under the table. It was such a small tremor that anyone else might have missed it. A slight shake in her fingers as she slid a folded napkin toward me, her smile still fixed politely at the far end of the dining table. The room was warm with the smell of roasted garlic and baked rosemary chicken, laughter bouncing off the cream, colored walls like sunlight. But that little tremble, it cut through all of it like a crack in glass. I opened the napkin slowly, shielding it with my palm, the way a child hides a secret note in class. Inside, written in my mother's careful slanted handwriting, were 5 words: "Pretend you feel sick. Leave now." My breath caught in my throat. For a second, I thought it was some strange joke. My mother had never been dramatic. Never the type for theatrics or pranks. Clodia Shaw was a woman who measured her words the way she measured flour when baking. Precise, deliberate, never excessive. If she said something, it meant something. I looked up at her. She did not look back at me immediately. She was nodding at Uncle Robert, who was mid. Story about a golf game nobody at the table truly cared about, but her jaw was tight, too tight. And her eyes, when they finally met mine, held a quiet urgency I had only seen once before, the night my father had a heart attack, and she had calmly packed a hospital bag while the rest of us panicked. I folded the napkin again, my fingers suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. My cousin Finn was across from me, laughing with a mouthful of mashed potatoes, oblivious. The chandelier above us hummed faintly, a spoon clinked against a plate. Someone asked for more gravy, and I stood up. "I'm sorry," I said, forcing a small smile. "I'm feeling a little dizzy. I think I need some air." There were polite murmurs, sympathetic nods. Aunt Linda touched my arm with soft concern. No one questioned it. Family dinners had always been a comfortable blur of routine, too much food, too much noise, and the comforting assumption that nothing truly bad could happen within those familiar walls. I walked toward the kitchen, my heart beat loud in my ears, each step feeling strangely disconnected from the floor. I didn't know what I expected to find: danger, silence, answers. Instead, I found the scent of cinnamon from a half-finished pie and the quiet ticking of the oven clock. Through the narrow doorway, I could still see the dining table. My mother had resumed her gentle smile, but she wasn't eating, she was watching. That was the first time I noticed Skylar Vance hadn't touched her own dish. Family dinners at Uncle Robert's house had always followed the same rhythm, like an old song you don't realize you've memorized until it starts playing. The long mahogany table polished to a shine, the mismatched chairs collected over decades, the soft yellow lighting that made everyone look kinder than they sometimes were. We gathered there for birthdays, anniversaries, or simply because Sunday felt incomplete without it. Uncle Robert liked to say that food was the glue of the family. He believed problems dissolved over soup and misunderstandings softened with dessert. Maybe that was why he insisted everyone bring a dish. Participation was his quiet way of ensuring unity. Even those who rarely spoke to each other would exchange recipes and compliments over casseroles. I had grown up in those dinners. I knew which chair creaked, which fork was slightly bent, which cousin always arrived late. They were the background music of my life, comforting, predictable, safe. Skylar Vance had been part of that music for as long as I could remember, though never quite family. She was one of those people who orbit a household for years until their presence feels permanent. A family friend, we called her. She had known Uncle Robert since college, back when his hair was still dark and his laugh louder. Gat. She brought elaborate dishes that looked like magazine photographs and spoke with a brightness that bordered on rehearsed. I never disliked her, but I never fully relaxed around her either. There was something about the way her smile lingered a second too long, or how her compliments felt polished instead of warm. My mother had always been polite to her, yet reserved. A subtle distance I never questioned until that night. The evening had begun like any other. I had arrived with my mother just before sunset, carrying a bowl of salad that no one would eat because Uncle Robert's meals were always too heavy for greens to stand a chance. Finn had greeted me with his usual hug half, tease about my being late even when I wasn't. The air had smelled of butter and baked bread. Skylar had arrived last, her arms full of a ceramic dish covered in foil. She announced it before she even reached the kitchen. "I made my special mushroom and herb bake," she said brightly. "Robert, you have to try it first." I remember the way she emphasized have. It wasn't pushy, just eager. Too eager, maybe. But at the time, it felt like enthusiasm, nothing more. She hovered as the dish was placed on the table, insisting everyone take generous portions. She served Finn herself, laughing when he joked about needing a second stomach, and my mother had watched. At the time, I thought she was simply tired. She had been quieter than usual that evening. Her laughter softer, her posture slightly stiff. I assumed it was one of her headaches. She often got them when the weather shifted. I never imagined her silence was observation, not discomfort. Standing in the kitchen doorway, pretending to steady myself against the counter, I replayed those small moments in my mind like puzzle pieces turning slowly into place. Skylar encouraging second helpings. Skylar refilling glasses. No one had emptied. Skylar smiling but never sitting long enough to eat. The laughter at the table. Finn lifted his fork for another bite of the mushroom bake, and my mother's eyes did not leave him. I didn't know what she knew. I didn't even know if she knew anything. But I felt it then. A quiet shift inside me, like the floor of certainty tilting ever so slightly. The comfort of routine had cracked, revealing something underneath I could not yet name. I told myself I was overthinking. Families were messy, dinners chaotic, people strange in harmless ways. Not every unease meant danger. Not every instinct meant truth. But my mother's handwriting on that napkin burned in my... Pretend you feel sick. Leave now. Somewhere between the smell of cinnamon and the ticking oven clock, I realized that the most frightening part wasn't knowing what was wrong. It was knowing that my mother did. I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, my fingers resting against the cool marble countertop as if it could steady the unease rising inside me. The sounds from the dining room drifted in waves, silverware clinking, chairs scraping, bursts of laughter that now felt strangely distant, like echoes from another house entirely. The world had not changed, and yet it had. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I poured myself a glass of water I did not want. The glass trembled slightly against my teeth when I took a sip. I kept my gaze fixed on the doorway, watching the table through the narrow gap between the doorframe and the wall. It felt almost wrong to observe my own family this way, like spying on something sacred. But my mother's note had shifted my role from participant to witness. Skylar moved around the table with a brightness that bordered on restlessness. She refilled plates before anyone asked, laughed a little too loudly at jokes that were barely humorous, and kept urging Uncle Robert to just try one more bite. Her voice had a sweetness to it, but underneath was a firmness I hadn't noticed before, a subtle insistence, like a hand pressing gently yet persistently against your shoulder. And still, she didn't eat. That detail grew louder in my mind the longer I watched. Her plate remained mostly untouched, the mushroom bake sitting neatly on the side as if it were decoration rather than food. She took tiny, theatrical nibbles of bread instead, dabbing her lips with a napkin after each bite. I told myself there could be a dozen innocent explanations. Maybe she wasn't hungry. Maybe she didn't like mushrooms as much as she claimed. Maybe she was simply nervous in social settings and expressed it through movement. Human behavior is a mosaic of quirks, after all. Not every oddity is a warning. But then I saw my mother shift in her chair. It was subtle. Anyone else might have mistaken it for adjusting her posture. But I knew her movements the way one knows the rhythm of their own heartbeat. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal focus. She was no longer part of the dinner conversation. She was studying it. My mother had always possessed a quiet awareness that bordered on uncanny. Growing up, she would sense things before they unfolded. A storm hours before the clouds gathered. A relative's bad news before the phone rang. She never called it intuition. She called it paying attention. But attention, when sharpened by love and experience, becomes something deeper, something almost protective. I remembered being 12 and trying to sneak out to a late-night movie with friends. I had planned it carefully, rehearsed my excuses, timed my footsteps, Yet just as I reached the door, she called my name from the hallway without even looking up from her book. "Where are you going?" The question had been calm, not accusatory. But it stopped me cold. She hadn't heard me. She had felt the shift. Standing there in the kitchen years later, I felt that same invisible thread tugging at it. Me, the one that connected her awareness to my safety. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition shaped by care. The oven clock ticked louder, or maybe my ears were simply searching for something steady to hold on to. I pressed my palms against the counter and tried to breathe slowly. My mind drifted back to the beginning of the evening, replaying Skylar's arrival with sharper clarity now. She had entered with a rush of cold air and perfume. Something floral but heavy, like lilies left too long in water. Her smile had been wide, almost triumphant. She had placed the ceramic dish on the table with both hands, announcing it as though unveiling a masterpiece. Uncle Robert had laughed and clapped her shoulder, calling her the queen of casseroles. She had beamed at the compliment, but her eyes had flickered quickly around the room, scanning faces, gauging reactions. At the time, it seemed like pride. Now, it felt like assessment. I leaned slightly closer to the doorway. Finn had nearly finished his second helping. He was always like that, enthusiastic with food, trusting with people. He had a way of assuming the best in everyone, a trait that made him lovable and, sometimes, vulnerable. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and reached again for the serving spoon. My mother's fingers tightened around her glass. That was when a faint memory surfaced, something small, almost forgettable. Earlier in the evening, while we were still in the living room, Skylar had insisted on taking everyone's coats to the hallway closet herself. It had seemed courteous, even charming. But I remembered my mother watching her then, too, her gaze following Skylar's back with the same quiet scrutiny. Why? What had she noticed that I hadn't? The question circled my mind like a moth around a light. Instinct is rarely loud. It doesn't shout or demand. It whispers, repeating itself softly until you either listen or regret not doing so. My mother had listened. She had acted with the calm efficiency of someone who trusted that whisper without needing proof. I wished in that moment that I had inherited more of that certainty. A burst of laughter erupted from the dining room. Uncle Robert was telling one of his exaggerated college stories again, his hands moving animatedly as if sculpting the memory in midair. The table leaned into his energy. Everyone smiling, everyone safe in the illusion that nothing could disrupt the warmth of shared food and familiar faces. Nothing ever does, until it does. I caught Skylar's reflection in the glass cabinet beside me. She was smiling, but her eyes were fixed on the table with an intensity that didn't match the lightness of her expression. It was the look of someone waiting for something, anticipating. Measuring time not in minutes, but in reactions. A chill crept along my arms despite the heat of the oven behind me. I realized then that the discomfort I felt wasn't just fear. It was the unsettling awareness that danger rarely arrives with thunder. It slips in quietly, wearing polite smiles and carrying homemade dishes. It sits at your table and laughs at your jokes. And if you are not careful, if no one is paying attention, it can pass through an evening unnoticed until the damage is already done. I thought again of the folded napkin in my purse. My mother's handwriting had been steady, not rushed. She had known exactly what she was doing. So, said Excels, and Enschmai, Tasten. She had chosen discretion over drama, protection over explanation. In that single note was years of maternal instinct distilled into 5 urgent words. From the dining room, Finn pushed his chair back slightly. At first, I assumed he was just shifting for comfort, but then he pressed a hand to his stomach. The movement was small. He laughed it off, saying something I couldn't hear clearly. The others chuckled with him, the moment dissolving into casual noise. But my mother did not laugh. Her eyes sharpened, her shoulders straightening just a fraction. It was the posture she took when she was about to step into a situation. Calm, controlled, already 3 steps ahead. She set her fork down gently beside her plate, aligning it with quiet precision. And in that instant, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. A mother's intuition is not mystical. It is built from years of observing the world through the lens of protection. It is noticing who eats and who doesn't, who insists and who hesitates, who watches instead of participates, who watch. It is love sharpened into awareness. I felt my heartbeat quicken, a dull thud against my ribs. Finn laughed again, but this time it sounded thinner. The room still looked the same. Warm lights, polished table, plates half full. Yet beneath the surface, something had begun to shift, like the first tremor before an earthquake. You don't see the ground move immediately. You just feel the certainty of stillness disappear. And standing there in the kitchen doorway, I realized that the most dangerous moments in life are not the loud ones. They are the quiet seconds when everything still appears normal, and only one person in the room knows it isn't. Finn's chair scraped back again, this time louder, sharper, the sound cutting through the chatter like a torn page. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates. It was a small interruption, the kind that normally draws nothing more than a curious glance. But I saw the way his smile faltered, the way his free hand pressed harder against his stomach as if trying to hold something in place. "I'm fine," he said, even though no one had asked yet. Those two words have always frightened me more than any confession. "I'm fine" is the phrase we use when we are anything but. It is a curtain drawn over discomfort, a polite lie offered to avoid being the center of concern. Finn said it with a laugh that sounded thinner than paper. From the kitchen, my mother watched him with the stillness of a lake before a storm. The next moments blurred into each other, like raindrops racing down a window. Finn's laughter dissolved into a cough. He reached for his glass of water and missed it the first time, his fingers knocking lightly against the rim. Aunt Linda leaned forward, her brows knitting with concern. Someone asked if he needed fresh air. Uncle Robert chuckled nervously, making a joke about overeating. Then Finn's knees buckled. The sound of his body hitting the floor was not loud, but it was final, a dull thud that silenced the room more effectively than a shout ever could. Chairs screeched back. Plates rattled. Someone gasped my name even though I was already moving, my feet carrying me forward before my mind had caught up. But my mother was faster. She reached him first, kneeling with a composure that felt almost unreal amid the chaos. Her voice cut through the rising panic with calm authority. "Call an ambulance," she said, not loudly, but firmly enough that no one hesitated. Uncle Robert fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. I hovered at the edge of the dining room, my pulse roaring in my ears. The smell of food, once comforting, now felt nauseating, thick with garlic and butter and something metallic I could not name. Finn lay on his side, eyes half open but unfocused, his breathing shallow. My aunt's hands fluttered uselessly above him, unsure where to land. And Skylar. Skylar stood frozen beside her chair, one hand gripping the backrest so tightly her knuckles blanched white. Her expression was not grief, not shock. It was something closer to calculation interrupted. Her gaze flicked from Finn to my mother, then to the dish on the table, her dish, and back again. It lasted only a second. But I saw it. My mother saw it too. The room filled with overlapping voices. Is he choking? Did he hit his head? Panic has a sound, a rising pitch of uncertainty that makes even simple actions feel complicated. Someone opened a window. Someone else fetched a glass of water that nobody used. My mother gently checked Finn's pulse, her movements efficient, practiced. She had taken a first aid course years ago and never forgot it. She tilted his head slightly, speaking to him in a low, steady tone. "Finn, can you hear me? Stay with me, sweetheart." Her calmness did not feel cold. It felt like an anchor thrown into turbulent water. I realized then that she had expected something. Maybe not this exact moment, not this exact collapse, but the possibility of harm had already crossed her mind hours earlier. That folded napkin had not been a guest. It had been a decision. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The sound wrapped around the house like a tightening ribbon. Relief mingled with dread inside me. Relief that help was coming. Dread that it was needed at all. Skylar finally moved. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. I don't understand. He was fine. Everyone was fine. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for agreement, for reassurance, for anything that would return the evening to its former shape. My mother looked up at her slowly. It wasn't an angry look. It wasn't even accusatory at first. It was the gaze of someone aligning puzzle pieces in her mind and realizing they formed a picture she had hoped not to see. She stood, wiping her hands gently on a napkin, and faced Skylar with quiet directness. "You didn't eat your own dish," she said. The words landed softly, but their weight was undeniable. The room stilled again, confusion giving way to a different kind of silence, the kind that listens. Skylar blinked. I wasn't hungry." My mother's head tilted slightly. "You insisted everyone else have seconds." "I was being polite," Skylar replied too quickly. Her voice had sharpened, losing its earlier sweetness. "Politeness does not tremble. Politeness does not avoid eye contact. The difference between courtesy and concealment is subtle." But in that moment, it became painfully clear. The sirens stopped outside. Doors opened. Heavy footsteps approached. The arrival of paramedics brought a rush of motion. Uniforms, equipment bags, firm voices asking precise questions. Finn was lifted onto a stretcher, oxygen mask secured, vitals checked. The professionals moved with practiced efficiency, their calm a mirror of my mother's. As they worked, my mother did not step back into the role of worried relative. She remained observant, her attention flicking briefly to the mushroom bake still sitting half, served on the table. The ceramic dish looked harmless, even inviting, its golden crust unbroken at the edges. It was astonishing how something so ordinary could now feel like an object of suspicion. Skylar's breathing grew audible, quick and shallow. She kept smoothing her hair, then clasping her hands, then smoothing her hair again, a loop of nervous gestures. Her eyes avoided the dish entirely now, as if it had become invisible. One of the paramedics asked what Finn had eaten. Plates were pointed to. Ingredients were listed. My mother's gaze never left Skylar's face. I felt the shift then, the moment suspicion solidifies into awareness. It is not dramatic. There is no thunderclap or music swelling in the background. It is simply the quiet realization that the pieces fit too well to be coincidence. When the stretcher rolled toward the door, Uncle Robert followed, his voice cracking as he promised to meet them at the hospital. The front door closed behind them, leaving the rest of us in a silence thick with the smell of untouched food and unanswered questions. My mother turned fully to Skylar. "Did you put something in that dish?" she asked. There was no shouting, no theatrics. Just a question delivered with the steadiness of someone who already knows the answer. Skylar's lips parted, then closed. Her eyes filled, not with sorrow, but with the panic of a secret losing its hiding place. The room seemed to lean toward her, every breath held in collective anticipation. And in that suspended second, I understood something that would stay with me long after the night ended. Truth rarely explodes into a room. It seeps in quietly, carried on the calm voice of someone brave enough to ask the right question. Skylar did not answer immediately. Hair silence stretched across the dining room like a thin wire pulled too tight. The chandelier above us hummed faintly, its light reflecting off half-finished plates and crystal glasses that suddenly looked like props abandoned mid-scene. I could hear my own breathing, shallow, uneven, and somewhere in the hallway, the old grandfather clock ticked with indifferent precision, marking seconds that felt heavier than minutes. My mother did not repeat the question. She didn't need to. The power of it lingered in the air, firm and unyielding. "Did you put something in that dish?" Skylar's fingers curled against the back of the chair. Her shoulders lifted as if she were bracing against cold wind, though the room was warm. For a brief moment, her face softened into something almost childlike, not guilt yet, but fear of being seen. Truly seen. It is a rare and terrifying experience to realize someone has looked past your words and found the intention beneath them. I don't know what you're implying," she said finally, her voice thin. My mother's expression didn't change. That was always her way. She never rushed to anger. She allowed truth the space to reveal itself. "I'm not implying anything," she replied calmly. "I'm asking." The rest of us stood in a quiet semicircle, our family bond suddenly fragile, like glassware trembling on a shelf. Aunt Linda pressed her hand to her mouth. My younger cousin stepped closer to me, his shoulder brushing mine, seeking reassurance neither of us had. The smell of mushrooms and herbs, once appetizing, had turned sour in my throat. Skylar's eyes flicked toward the front door, then to the dish on the table, then back to my mother. Her composure was unraveling thread by thread. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and for a moment I thought she might run. Not physically, she had nowhere to go, but emotionally, the way people retreat behind denial when truth becomes unbearable. The paramedics returned briefly, one of them asking if there were any leftovers of what Finn had eaten. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of realization spread across the room. My mother gestured toward the mushroom bake without breaking eye contact with Skylar. That was when Skylar's breathing changed. It became audible, sharp, each inhale catching halfway as if her lungs had forgotten their rhythm. She shook her head, a small, desperate motion. "It's just food," she whispered. "You're all overreacting." But overreaction doesn't arrive with ambulances. Overreaction doesn't lie pale and motionless on a stretcher. My mother stepped slightly aside to allow the paramedic to take the dish. Hair movements were slow, deliberate, dignified. She was not trying to humiliate Skylar. She was making room for facts. There is a quiet strength in letting evidence speak louder than emotion. When the front door closed again and the sirens faded into the distance, the house felt hollow, like a shell after the tide recedes. Skylar's shoulders sagged. The brightness she had worn all evening dissolved, leaving behind a tired, brittle version of herself I had never seen before. "I didn't mean," she began, then stopped. My mother tilted her head gently. "Didn't mean what?" The words came out of Skylar in fragments, like pieces of glass slipping from her grasp. "I didn't mean for him. It wasn't supposed to be him." A collective breath left the room. I felt it brush past my cheek, warm and trembling. The confession didn't arrive with shouting or dramatic gestures. It arrived quietly, almost apologetically, and somehow that made it more devastating. "It was Robert," she said, her voice cracking. "He ruined my life. Uncle Robert, the man who believed food glued families together. The man who had welcomed her into his home for decades. The man who was now racing behind an ambulance, unaware that he had been the intended target of the dish he'd praised minutes earlier." Skylar sank into her chair as if her legs could no longer hold her. Tears welled in her eyes, but they did not fall immediately. They clung there, suspended, much like the truth had been suspended all evening, waiting for gravity to claim it. "He promised me a partnership," she continued, her voice trembling. "Years ago, we built that business together, and then he cut me out, said it was just business. I lost everything. My savings. My future." Her hands opened helplessly in her lap. He never even apologized. The room listened, caught between empathy and horror. Pain, when spoken aloud, has a way of demanding acknowledgement, even when it has led someone to terrible choices. I saw Aunt Linda's eyes soften for a fraction of a second, understanding flickering there before responsibility hardened her expression again. "But poisoning someone?" my mother asked quietly, not accusing, simply naming the act for what it was. Skylar's tears finally fell. "I didn't think it would be that bad." "Just enough to scare him, to make him sick, to make him feel what I felt." Her voice broke. "I didn't plan for Finn. I didn't plan for anyone else. Intent does not erase consequence." That truth hung in the air like a bell's echo. I felt a strange mix of emotions rising inside me. Anger for Finn, disbelief at the betrayal, and, unexpectedly, a sliver of sorrow for the woman unraveling before us. Not sorrow for her actions, but for the years of bitterness that had hollowed her out until revenge seemed like justice. It was a sobering realization. People rarely wake up one morning and choose cruelty. They drift toward it step by step, justifying each move until they no longer recognize the person they've become. The police arrived shortly after, their presence firm but not aggressive. Questions were asked. Statements were taken. Skylar did not resist when they gently guided her toward the door. She looked smaller somehow, her earlier brightness replaced by a weary resignation. As she passed the table, her gaze fell on the empty space where her dish had been. Her shoulders shook once, then stilled. The front door closed behind her with a soft click. Silence settled over the house again, but it was no longer the same silence as before. This one carried understanding, heavy, irreversible. The warmth of the evening had drained away, leaving behind the stark realization that danger had sat among us wearing a familiar smile. My mother exhaled slowly, her composure finally softening at the edges. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. "Finn will be okay," she said, more to reassure the room than herself. I nodded, though my mind was still catching up to the reality of what had unfolded. The mahogany table, the polished silverware, the untouched desserts, they all looked different now, as if the evening had peeled away a layer of innocence we hadn't known was there. In that moment, I understood that betrayal does not always come from strangers or enemies. Sometimes it arrives through doors we have opened willingly, carried by people we have welcomed without question. And the most painful part is not just the act itself, it is the realization that trust, once cracked, never quite returns to its original shape. Yet amid the shock and sorrow, one truth stood clear and steady. My mother had paid attention, and because she had, we were not mourning a life that night, only the loss of an illusion. The house did not feel like a house anymore after they left. It felt like the echo of one. After. The air still carried the scent of cooked herbs and warm bread, but without laughter, without Finn's easy jokes or Uncle Robert's booming voice. The smells turned stale, almost mournful. Plates remained half full on the table, forks resting where their owners had dropped them in panic. A glass lay tipped on its side, a thin ribbon of water slowly creeping toward the edge of the polished wood. Ordinary objects, frozen in the exact positions they had occupied when everything changed. I helped Aunt Linda gather the dishes in silence. Porcelain touched porcelain with soft, hollow clicks. No one had the appetite to eat. The food that had been prepared with such care now felt like evidence rather than nourishment. My mother moved through the room quietly, her presence steady but subdued, as if she were conserving energy for the next inevitable wave of emotion. When the last plate was set in the sink, she finally looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the fatigue beneath her calm. It wasn't fear, it was the weight of vigilance, the toll of having been right when she would have preferred to be wrong. "We should go to the hospital," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded once. "We will. But first, breathe." It seemed like such a simple instruction, almost trivial after what we had witnessed. Yet I realized I hadn't taken a full breath since reading her note. My lungs had been working, yes, but my body had been living in shallow air, suspended between tension and disbelief. I inhaled deeply, the scent of dish soap and lingering rosemary filling my chest, and exhaled slowly. The world steadied just a fraction. On the drive to the hospital, the city lights blurred past the window like streaks of melted gold. My mother kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, her posture upright, her gaze forward. She did not fidget. She did not replay the scene aloud the way I felt tempted to. Silence, with her, was not avoidance. It was processing. I studied her profile in the dim glow of passing streetlights, the faint crease between her brows, the calm set of her lips. She had always been like this in moments of crisis, composed, efficient, quietly protective. Growing up, I had sometimes mistaken that calm for emotional distance. I had wished she would panic the way other mothers did, raise her voice, cry openly. It took years for me to understand that her calm was not a lack of feeling. It was discipline shaped by love. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sterile and unforgiving. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Uncle Robert paced near the reception desk, his jacket draped over one arm, his hair disheveled in a way I had never seen before. When he saw us, relief and guilt crossed his face at the same time, relief that we were there, guilt that the danger had come through his door. "They're pumping his stomach," he said quickly. "They said he should be okay. They caught it early. Caught it early." The phrase echoed in my mind. Early because of a folded napkin. Early because of 5 handwritten words. The enormity of that realization settled over me like a quiet wave. We sat together for what felt like hours, but was likely less than one. Time in hospitals stretches strangely, bending around uncertainty. Every passing nurse made our heads lift in hope. Every distant beep of a monitor tightened our shoulders. When the doctor finally approached, his expression gentle but professional. "He's stable," he said. "It appears to be a toxic reaction to something ingested, but he responded well to treatment. He'll need observation, but he's out of immediate danger." Out of danger. The words were like warm sunlight breaking through thick clouds. Aunt Linda began to cry softly. Uncle Robert sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. My mother closed her eyes for a brief second, not in exhaustion, but in gratitude. A private thank you to whatever force had aligned events just enough to spare us irreversible loss. When we were finally allowed to see Finn, he looked pale, but conscious. His usual brightness dimmed yet present. He managed a weak smile when he saw us. "Guess I overdid it on the mushrooms," he joked hoarsely. Humor, even fragile humor, felt like a gift. My mother squeezed his hand gently. She didn't correct him, didn't burden him with the full truth in that moment. There is wisdom in knowing when to reveal details and when to let healing come first. I watched her and realized that protection is not only about preventing harm, sometimes it is about choosing the timing of truth. Later, in the quiet hallway outside his room, Uncle Robert turned to my mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "How did you know?" he asked. She hesitated, as if weighing how to answer without sounding dramatic. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I noticed, that was all." Not intuition, not foresight. Just noticing. Yet within that simple word lived years of observing human behavior, the refusal to eat one's own dish, the over-insistence, the restless hovering. Clues so small they could easily be dismissed, yet together they formed a warning clear enough for her to act. On the drive home, the city was quieter, the night deeper. I held the folded napkin in my lap, tracing the indentations of her pen through the paper. It struck me how ordinary it looked, just a piece of linen with ink. No alarm bells, no flashing lights. And yet it had altered the course of the evening entirely. I almost ignored it, I admitted softly. She glanced at me briefly, then back to the road. "But you didn't. I thought maybe you were overreacting." A faint smile touched her lips. "We all second. Guess instinct." The key is not letting doubt silence it. Her words settled into me with a quiet permanence. I realized that intuition is not the opposite of logic. It is logic informed by experience, filtered through care. It is the mind noticing patterns before the heart has words for them. That night, lying in my bed, sleep slow to arrive, I replayed the evening not as a series of shocking events, but as a chain of small observations, a dish untouched, a smile too bright, a mother's hand trembling beneath a table. None of those moments alone would have meant much. Together they formed a language I had never learned to read until it was spoken in urgency. I understood then that safety is rarely the result of grand heroics. More often, it is the product of quiet awareness, of someone choosing to pay attention when others are comfortable looking away. And I made a silent promise to myself, there in the dark, to notice, to listen when something feels off, and to never again dismiss the soft voice of caution simply because it whispers instead of shouts. The days that followed felt strangely ordinary, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part. The sun still rose at the same hour. The bakery on the corner still released the scent of fresh bread into the morning air. My phone still buzzed with trivial notifications about sales and birthdays and weather updates. The world had not paused to acknowledge that our family had brushed against something dangerous. It continued, indifferent, but inside our circle, the atmosphere had shifted. News travels quickly through families, faster than wind, quieter than thunder. By the second day, distant relatives were calling, their voices heavy with concern and curiosity. "Is Finn all right? What really happened?" "I heard something about poisoning." Each conversation reopened the memory like a door that refused to stay shut. My mother handled the calls with the same calm precision she had shown that night. She never dramatized, never embellished. She spoke only the facts, her tone gentle but firm. "My never say." There was dignity in the way she told the story, as if she were protecting not only Finn but the integrity of the truth itself. Uncle Robert, on the other hand, struggled. I visited him 3 days later. His house, once filled with the warm chaos of gatherings, felt hollow, the silence echoing off the walls. Amend. The mahogany table stood polished and empty, chairs pushed neatly in as if awaiting guests who might never return. He offered me tea with hands that trembled slightly, the porcelain cup rattling against its saucer. "I keep replaying it," he admitted, sitting across from me. Her face, her voice. "I keep thinking, how did I not see it? Guilt is a quiet thief. It slips in through hindsight, convincing you that clarity was always available when, in truth, it only arrives after the fact." I reached across the table and touched his hand lightly. "You trusted someone you'd known for years," I said. "That's humanity," he exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight he had been carrying alone. "I invited her into my home, into all our lives, and you also raised a family that noticed when something was wrong," I replied gently. "That matters too." The investigation moved forward with the steady rhythm of official procedures, statements, lab results, court dates whispered like distant thunder. Skylar's confession had made the legal path straightforward, but the emotional aftermath was anything but simple. People wanted a villain, a clear line separating good from bad. I found myself thinking about her more than I expected, not to excuse her actions. Nothing could justify what she had done, but to understand the long road of resentment that had led her there. It frightened me, the idea that bitterness, left unchecked, could grow quietly inside someone for years, shaping their decisions. And one evening, my mother and I sat on her porch as the sky softened into shades of lavender and gold. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the neighbor's garden. She handed me a cup of chamomile tea, the steam curling upward like a sigh. "Do you ever think about her?" I asked. She didn't pretend not to know who I meant. "Yes," she said simply. "Are you angry?" She considered the question, her gaze resting on the horizon where the last sliver of sun disappeared. "I'm saddened," she answered. "Anger is loud. Sadness is quieter, but it stays longer." Her words settled into me like evening dew. I realized that while anger demands expression, sadness demands understanding. My mother wasn't excusing Skylar's choices. She was acknowledging the tragedy of a life shaped by unresolved hurt. The community's reaction unfolded in predictable waves. At first, shock and sympathy. Finally, a cautious return to routine. Invitations resumed, but with subtle changes, potlucks became smaller. Dishes labeled more carefully, conversations edged with an awareness that trust, once shaken, takes time to rebuild. At Finn's welcome home dinner 2 weeks later, the table looked almost the same as always. Almost. The lighting was warm, the plates neatly arranged, the laughter returning in cautious bursts. But beneath it all was a new attentiveness, people noticing who served what, who ate what, who hovered too long near a plate. It wasn't paranoia. It was awareness sharpened by experience. Finn himself handled it with remarkable grace. "I guess I'm the family's official food tester now," he joked, raising his glass. Humor again, fragile but healing. His resilience became a bridge that helped the rest of us step forward without fear. As the evening wound down, my mother caught my eye from across the table. It was a brief glance, a silent exchange of understanding. No words were needed. We both knew that while the event had been frightening, it had also revealed something powerful: the strength of paying attention, the quiet heroism of noticing small details. Later that night, walking home under the soft glow of streetlights, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known before. The world hadn't become more dangerous in those weeks. It had simply become more visible. I understood now that safety is not about living in suspicion, nor is it about blind trust. It is about balance, the willingness to open your heart while keeping your eyes gently, respectfully aware. The public consequence of that night was not only Skylar's arrest or the legal proceedings that followed. It was the collective lesson etched into our family's memory, that intuition, when grounded in observation and care, is not paranoia. It is protection. And as I slipped the old folded napkin, now carefully smoothed and kept in my journal, between its pages I realized it had become more than a reminder of danger avoided. It had become a symbol of something quieter and far more enduring. The power of a mother's attention, the strength of noticing what others overlook, and the understanding that justice, when guided by calm rather than fury, leaves room for healing instead of hatred. Healing did not arrive all at once. It came the way morning light enters a room, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed until you realize the darkness has softened. There was no single day when... Instead, there were small moments that stitched themselves together like careful thread, forming something new where the old fabric had torn. A week after Finn returned home, my mother invited me over for breakfast. It was a simple invitation, the kind she had extended hundreds of times before, yet it carried a subtle intention I recognized immediately. Breakfast had always been her way of restoring balance. Dinner is for celebration, for noise and abundance. Breakfast is for grounding, for beginnings. Her kitchen smelled of toasted bread and brewed coffee, the windows cracked open just enough to let in the cool morning air. Sunlight rested gently on the wooden table, illuminating the faint scratches left by years of family meals. I watched her move between the stove and the counter with quiet efficiency, her slippers whispering against the tile floor. There was comfort in those familiar sounds, the click of the toaster, the soft scrape of butter against warm bread, the steady pour of coffee into ceramic mugs. After weeks of hospital corridors and tense conversations, the simplicity felt almost sacred. You're watching me like... Performing a magic trick, she said with a small smile, sliding a plate toward me. In a way, you are, I replied. You're making things feel normal again. She sat across from me, her fingers curling around her mug. Normal is just a series of small rituals, she said thoughtfully. When we keep them, we remind ourselves that life continues. We ate in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, a bird landed on the fence, tilting its head as if curious about our quiet world. But I realized that healing often hides in these ordinary scenes, not in grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but in the steady repetition of simple acts, sharing food, opening windows, brewing coffee. Later that morning, I helped her water the small garden behind her house. The scent of damp soil rose into the air. She handed me a watering can, its metal surface cool against my palm. As we moved from plant to plant, she spoke without looking directly at me. I worried you might start doubting everyone, she said. I did, for a few days. I adjusted the stream of water over a row of basil leaves. But then I realized, if I let fear shape my view of people, Skylar would still be influencing my life. And I don't want that. My mother nodded slowly. Exactly. Awareness is not the same as suspicion. One keeps you safe, the other keeps you trapped. Her distinction settled into me with clarity. Awareness opens your eyes. Suspicion closes your heart. The balance between them is delicate, but it is also where wisdom lives. In the weeks that followed, our family gatherings resumed. Smaller at first, quieter, almost tentative. There were fewer dishes on the table, fewer overlapping conversations. But there was also a new tenderness, a shared understanding that what we had nearly lost was not just a life, but a sense of security we had taken for granted. At Finn's birthday dinner, he stood to make a toast, his glass raised with his usual crooked grin. To family, he said, and to paying attention. Apparently it's life, saving. Laughter rippled around the table, warm and genuine. Humor had become our bridge back to ease, a way to acknowledge the past without letting it dominate the present. I looked at my mother across the table. She wasn't the center of attention, nor did she want to be. She simply smiled, her eyes soft with relief. That was her way, never claiming credit, never dramatizing her role. Yet I knew, and so did everyone else, that her quiet vigilance had altered the course of that night. Healing, I learned, is not about forgetting what happened. It is about placing it in its proper position, not at the front of your mind, dictating every decision, but somewhere in the background, informing your awareness without overshadowing your peace. One evening, months later, I found the folded napkin again while reorganizing my journal. The ink had faded slightly, the fabric softened with time. I traced the words with my fingertip. Pretend you feel sick. Leave now. The urgency that once made my pulse race now felt different. It no longer represented fear. It represented care, distilled, immediate, unwavering care. I realized that the lesson of that night was not about danger itself, but about the quiet power of noticing and acting with calm courage. I began to notice more in my daily life after that. The hesitation in a coworker's voice when they said they were fine. The subtle tension in a friend's shoulders when they laughed too quickly. Number etiquette. The way my own body reacted when something didn't sit right. These observations didn't make me anxious. They made me present. They deepened my connections instead of weakening them. And perhaps that was the greatest gift hidden within the ordeal. A sharpened sense of empathy. Awareness isn't only for detecting threats. It is also for recognizing needs, the unspoken worries, the silent burdens people carry. My mother had taught me that paying attention is an act of love as much as it is an act of protection. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, as we sat together on her porch watching the sky shift from blue to amber, I finally said what had been resting in my heart for months. "Thank you," I told her. She looked at me with gentle confusion. "For what?" "For noticing," I replied. "For trusting yourself. For trusting me enough to tell me without causing panic." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "One day," she said softly, "you'll do the same for someone else." That's how care travels, quietly, from one person to another. Her words lingered with me long after the sun dipped below the horizon. I understood then that the true resolution of that night was not Skylar's arrest or the hospital's reassurance. It was the strengthening of an invisible thread, the bond between intuition and action, between love and attention. Life did not return to exactly what it had been before. It became something slightly wiser, slightly more attentive, and, in a quiet way, more grateful. Because when you come close to losing what feels secure, you learn to hold the ordinary with deeper appreciation. And in that appreciation, healing finds its home. And sometimes when I think back to that night, I don't remember the sirens first, or the shouting, or even the fear that gripped my chest like a tightening fist. I remember a folded napkin, 5 handwritten words, a mother's steady hand, a quiet decision made without drama or applause. Life rarely warns us with flashing lights. More often, it whispers. It nudges. It places small details in our path and waits to see whether we will notice them. A dish left untouched. A smile that doesn't reach the eyes. A feeling in your stomach that something isn't quite right, even when everything looks perfectly normal. For years, I believed intuition was something mystical, a gift only certain people possessed, but I learned that night that intuition is simply attention shaped by love. It is watching carefully because you care deeply. It is trusting your inner voice not because it is loud, but because it is honest. My mother didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She didn't create panic. She observed, she trusted what she saw, and she acted with calm courage. And in doing so, she changed the ending of our story without ever raising her voice. We often think strength looks like confrontation or grand gestures, but sometimes strength looks like a gentle note passed under a table. Sometimes it looks like noticing what others overlook. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to listen to the whisper instead of waiting for the scream. So I ask you this, from one heart to another, when your intuition speaks softly. Do you listen? And if this story touched you, if it reminded you of someone who once protected you without you even realizing it, hold them a little closer. Leave a word of kindness. Share your thoughts. Because stories like these aren't just told, they are carried from one person to the next, like small lights in the dark,